The Vorrkai ships vanished at 3:47 a.m., Greenwich Mean Time, on a Tuesday in November. Dr. Mara Osei was awake when it happened. She was always awake at 3:47 a.m., had been for 6 years, ever since the first Vorrkai vessel appeared above the Namib Desert and reduced 300 square kilometers of sand to black glass in under 4 minutes. Sleep, after that, had become a luxury she no longer knew how to afford. She was in her office at the Global Defense Science Cooperative's facility outside Geneva, a converted particle accelerator campus, its original purpose long since repurposed for the grim mathematics of survival, when the alert pinged on her monitor. She almost ignored it. Alerts were constant. Alerts were noise. Alerts meant another city was gone, another fleet reduced to orbital debris, another attempt at communication had failed. But then she noticed the silence. Not metaphorical silence. Actual silence. The ambient hum of the facility's defense tracking systems. A sound so omnipresent she had stopped hearing it years ago, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat, had ceased. The 17 monitors on her wall, each tracking a different cluster of Vorrkai ship signatures, were dark. Not damaged. Dark. She stood slowly, the coffee mug in her hand tilting without her noticing, cold liquid spreading across her desk and soaking into 6 months of handwritten notes. She walked to the nearest monitor and touched the screen with 2 fingers, as if the glass might tell her something the data couldn't. The tracking grid was empty. She ran to the control room. It was already chaos, but the good kind of chaos, the kind she hadn't seen since before the war. Analysts were embracing. Someone had produced a bottle of champagne from a desk drawer, which meant someone had been keeping champagne in a desk drawer for a very long time, waiting for exactly this moment. Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Adeyemi, the facility's military liaison, was on the phone with Brussels, then with Washington, then with the Joint Command bunker beneath the Alps, his voice rising with each call from professional calm to something approaching disbelief. "They're all gone," Mara said to no one in particular. "Every single one." Dr. Petra Vosicek, her closest colleague, grabbed her by both arms. Petra's eyes were red, her face cracked open with something raw and enormous. "Mara, every single one. All 17,000 confirmed signatures. All at once. All gone." "Gone how? Does it matter?" Petra laughed, actually laughed, a sound Mara hadn't heard from her in years. "They're gone." Mara looked back at the monitors. At the empty grids. At the dark spaces where, for 6 years, the Vorrkai had hung in the atmosphere like a sentence that could not be finished. "Yes," she said quietly. "It matters very much how." Nobody heard her. The champagne cork hit the ceiling. Outside, the world was waking up to its miracle. By dawn, the celebrations had begun in every city that still had streets intact enough to fill. In São Paulo, 3 million people gathered along the restored waterfront and wept openly for 2 hours before anyone thought to play music, and then the music didn't stop for 4 days. In Seoul, in Lagos, in what remained of Warsaw, in the refugee sprawl outside of what used to be Phoenix, people emerged from the years-long crouch of survival and looked at the sky and found it empty and clean and, for the first time in memory, entirely their own. World leaders appeared before cameras within hours, most of them visibly having wept themselves, making speeches that had clearly been prepared and kept in reserve for exactly this occasion. The Secretary-General of the United Nations called it the greatest morning in human history. The American president said humanity had proven its indomitable spirit. The Chinese premier spoke for 11 minutes without notes. The French president was so overcome he had to pause twice. Mara watched all of it from the facility's break room. On a small television someone had propped on the counter next to the coffee machine. She watched, and she drank her coffee, and she thought about a problem that was bothering her, a specific, technical, deeply unsettling problem, and the louder the celebrations became on the screen, the more the problem bothered her. The Vorrkai had never, in 6 years of sustained warfare, retreated. Not once. Not a meter. Not a ship. Every engagement, and there had been thousands, had been a forward action on their part, or a holding action, or an annihilation. They did not regroup. They did not reassess. They pressed forward with a mechanical, almost meditative persistence that had convinced most military strategists that the Vorrkai were not so much a civilization making war as a process executing a program. You could not reason with a process. You could not frighten a program. So what had stopped it? "You should go outside," said Yusuf, appearing beside her with his own coffee. He was still in his uniform, but he'd loosened his collar. There's about 30 people dancing in the parking lot. Someone's brought a speaker. What stopped them? Mara said. Yusuf looked at her for a moment. He was a patient man. It was one of the things she respected about him, and he recognized the expression on her face as the one that meant her mind was working in a direction that most people would find inconvenient. We don't know yet. Exactly. Maybe they ran out of something. Resources. Energy. Maybe they accomplished whatever they came to accomplish. They came to kill us, Yusuf. We're still here. Maybe they changed their minds. She looked at him. He had the good grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I need access to all the tracking data from the last 72 hours, she said. The raw feeds, not the processed summaries. And I need the spectral analysis from the last known positions of the ships. Mara, I know. I know everyone wants to celebrate. I want to celebrate too. She paused. She was not sure this was entirely true. But something happened last night that has no precedent in 6 years of war. An enemy that did not retreat, did not communicate, did not demonstrate any behavior other than sustained aggression, simply ceased. And I need to understand why before I'm willing to believe we're safe. Yusuf studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll get you the data. Thank you. For the record, he said, pausing at the door, I think you should also go outside. Even for 10 minutes. The sky is very blue today, Mara. It's worth seeing. She turned back to the television. The Secretary-General was shaking hands with a line of dignitaries that seemed to have no end. I'll see the sky, she said. Later. The data was worse than she'd expected. By which she meant, more interesting. By which she meant, more terrifying. She spent 4 days with it before she was ready to speak. The raw tracking feeds from the 72 hours preceding the disappearance showed something she'd been too busy surviving to notice in real time. The Vorrkai ships had not simply vanished. Their departure had followed a pattern. A precise, geometric, mathematically consistent pattern, moving outward from 17 specific points on the globe in 17 synchronized spirals, like a set of locks all turning at once. She mapped it 3 times to be sure. Then she called Petra. Petra came to her office at 11 at night, still glowing faintly with the residual warmth of the celebrations she'd been part of for 4 days. She looked healthy. She looked rested. She looked, Mara thought, like someone who had decided the war was over and had physically rearranged herself around that decision. Look at this, Mara said, and turned her monitor around. Petra looked. The glow faded incrementally, the way sunlight fades when a cloud moves over it. What am I looking at? The departure vectors of all 17,000 confirmed Vorrkai vessels, mapped over the 72 hours before disappearance. Color-coded by time sequence. Mara tapped the screen. They didn't flee. They withdrew. There's a difference. Fleeing is chaotic. It looks like a burst, everything moving outward randomly. This is coordinated. This is deliberate. This is a retreat, Petra said slowly. Not even a retreat. A repositioning. Mara pulled up a second screen. Now look at this. These are the 17 origin points of the spiral patterns. Mark them on a globe. Petra stared at the globe that materialized on the adjacent monitor. 17 red dots, distributed across the planet's surface. She was quiet for a long time. They're not random, she said. No. They're symmetrical. Perfectly symmetrical. As if someone very carefully distributed 17 points across a sphere to achieve maximum even coverage. Mara let that sit for a moment. Those 17 points, Petra. They correspond precisely to the 17 locations where Vorrkai ground forces made their deepest incursions. The places where they spent the most time. The places where they were. She stopped. She made herself say it. The places where they were doing something. The silence in the room was different from the silence outside, where the celebrations had finally quieted into the long exhalation of a world beginning to believe in its own survival. What are you saying? Petra asked. I'm saying they weren't trying to destroy us. Or at least, not only trying to destroy us. I'm saying the war itself may have been the cover, the distraction, for something else they were doing at those 17 sites. And I'm saying that when they finished doing it, they left. Not because we beat them. Not because they gave up. Because they were done. Petra sat down in the chair across from Mara's desk. She looked at the globe for a very long time. What were they doing at the sites? She finally asked. That, Mara said, is what I need to find out. Getting access to the 17 sites proved to be the first real fight. The Global Defense Cooperative had been reorganized 3 times since the disappearance, as the military apparatus designed for a war suddenly found itself administering a peace. The joint command structure that had coordinated humanity's defense across 6 years and 47 nations was dissolving with remarkable speed, its authority draining away into the celebrations, into the politics of reconstruction, into the sudden urgent business of counting the living and planning for a future that had spent 6 years seeming theoretical. General Harriet Vance, who had commanded the North American theater and was now something called the Interim Director of Transition Security, a title that Mara suspected had been invented specifically to give someone authority over her, received her in a temporary office in what used to be a Vorrkai exclusion zone outside Denver. The office had paper on the walls, actual blueprints and recovery maps, and a window that looked out onto a sky full of construction drones. Vance was 63, gray-haired, made almost entirely of controlled competence, and had the specific expression of someone who was managing an enormous amount of simultaneous pressures while also being asked to manage one more thing. Dr. Osei, she said, I've read your preliminary report. Then you understand why I need access to the 17 sites. I understand what you're suggesting. I'm not certain I understand why you're suggesting it, given the current, she paused. She was too disciplined to use the word atmosphere, but Mara felt its absence. Given the current state of global recovery. With respect, General, the current state of global recovery is precisely why I'm suggesting it. If I'm wrong, we've spent some resources examining 17 abandoned alien sites and found nothing, which will actually reinforce public confidence. If I'm right. If you're right, we have a problem that nobody is currently emotionally prepared to hear about. Vance put her hands flat on the desk. Dr. Osei, I want to be honest with you. You have an excellent scientific reputation. Your work on Vorrkai energy signatures has been invaluable. But what you're proposing, essentially telling the world that the war isn't over, that we're in some kind of trap, the timing of that proposal matters. The timing of a trap also matters, Mara said. That's rather the point. Give me something concrete. Give me evidence beyond pattern analysis that something was done at those sites, and I'll give you the access. Right now all you have is geometry. Geometry is how they think. Geometry is how they built things. Bring me something physical. Then we'll talk. It was not a no, but it felt like a door closing. She found a way through Yusuf, who found a way through a lieutenant colonel he trusted, who found a way through a civilian recovery team that was already operating near Site 7, a stretch of high plateau in southern Peru that had been a Vorrkai ground force position for nearly 2 years. The recovery team was there to document damage and catalog artifacts. Their mandate was archaeological, not investigative. They were not looking for what Mara was looking for. She arrived at Site 7 31 days after the disappearance, which meant 31 days into the worldwide celebration, which meant she arrived to find the country around her transforming visibly, people returning to abandoned towns, smoke from cooking fires rather than burning buildings, children in the roads, while she drove in the opposite direction, toward the site, toward the silence, toward the place where the Vorrkai had spent 22 months doing something no one had been close enough or alive enough to observe. The plateau was vast and featureless from a distance. Up close, it was anything but. The surface had been altered. Not damaged, not in the way of a battle or an occupation. Altered. The rock itself had been modified at a molecular level, which she confirmed with the portable spectrometer she'd brought over the recovery team's confused objections. The alterations formed a pattern, of course they formed a pattern, that covered the entire plateau in a grid too subtle to see from standing height but perfectly legible from the drone footage she spent her first night analyzing. The grid was a mechanism. She was certain of it within 48 hours. She could not yet determine what kind. But in the center of the plateau, where the grid lines converged, she found the thing that made her stop breathing for approximately 15 seconds. A structure. Small, no larger than a shipping container, made from a material that the spectrometer identified as no known terrestrial element or compound, which was itself interesting, but not as interesting as what the structure was doing. It was emitting a signal, extremely faint, cycling on a period of roughly 40,000 seconds, just over 11 hours. Inward pointing, which was why no one had detected it from orbit. Pointed directly down, into the rock, into the earth, toward whatever was beneath. She stood next to it in the thin air of the high plateau with the wind pulling at her jacket, and she looked at this small container-shaped object that the Vorrkai had left behind when they left, had deliberately left behind, and she felt the specific fear that lives not in your chest but somewhere deeper, in the hinge of the jaw and the backs of the knees. They hadn't finished. They had only finished one phase. She presented her findings to the Cooperative Science Advisory Board 6 weeks after the disappearance, 5 weeks after most of the board members had submitted transition period budget proposals assuming peacetime operations. The boardroom was well lit and comfortable in a way that the facilities rooms had not been during the war, when everyone had unconsciously maintained an emergency aesthetic, as if carpets and good chairs might be tempting fate. Now there were carpets again. Good chairs. A catered lunch. 14 scientists, for military liaisons including Yusuf, and General Vance on a video screen from Washington. Mara had prepared for 6 hours. She had triple-checked every figure. She had anticipated every objection. She presented for 40 minutes. The silence at the end was not, she recognized immediately, the silence of people processing something frightening. It was the silence of people deciding how to respond to something inconvenient. Dr. Marcus Webb, atmospheric physicist, former weapons consultant, recently appointed to the board's Transition Science Subcommittee, whatever that meant, spoke first. He had a precise, reasonable voice that Mara had learned to distrust, because it was equally precise and equally reasonable regardless of what he was saying. "The signal you detected at Site 7, he said. You've confirmed it at other sites?" "I've confirmed it at 3 others, remotely. The signal characteristics are identical. But you haven't physically visited those sites." "I've been denied access to most of them pending the board's assessment." A brief acknowledging pause from Webb. "The pattern analysis you've conducted, the departure vectors, this is based on your own modeling of the tracking data?" "My modeling, cross-checked with 2 colleagues. And alternative explanations for the pattern. I've considered, such as confirmation bias in the modeling parameters, or the possibility that what appears as coordinated geometry is simply the result of gravitational and atmospheric factors affecting ship movement at scale." "That's not what's happening." "Have been considered and ruled out?" "Yes. I've ruled them out. The math is in the report." She kept her voice level. She had known this conversation would happen, and she had promised herself she would stay level. "The geometric precision is 11 decimal places, Dr. Webb. Gravitational and atmospheric variation would corrupt that precision at the 3rd decimal." "The signal at the sites," said another board member, Dr. Amaran Kosi, who was kinder but no more useful. "You describe it as inward pointing. Meaning it's not broadcasting outward, not calling the Vorrkai back." "Correct. It's transmitting into the Earth." "Into the Earth. To what?" "That's what I'm trying to find out. That's why I'm here." General Vance cleared her throat on the screen. "Dr. Osei, your findings are genuinely significant, and I don't want to dismiss them. But I want to make sure I understand your central claim. You believe the Vorrkai conducted 6 years of planetary warfare as cover for installing a network of devices at 17 sites around the globe, which are now operating, transmitting signals into the Earth, and that this represents a pause." "What, exactly?" "A delayed weapon. I don't know what it represents. That's why I need resources to investigate. What I know is that an enemy that never retreated left in a coordinated, deliberate, geometrically precise fashion left active technology behind, and that everyone is currently celebrating a victory that I cannot find any evidence we actually achieved. That combination of facts should terrify this board." The silence again. Webb made a small note on his tablet. Nkosi looked at the table. "I want to recommend," Webb said carefully, "a working group to review Dr. Osei's methodology and assess the signal findings with additional instrumentation. 6 weeks, perhaps 8. I'm recommending immediate investigation of all 17 sites with full resource allocation," Mara said. "That recommendation will be considered alongside Dr. Webb's proposal," said the board chair, a diplomat named Harrington who had come to the cooperative from arms negotiations and who approached scientific disagreement with the same placid, careful neutrality he applied to treaties. Both recommendations will go forward. She knew what that meant. She had sat in enough rooms to know what both recommendations will go forward meant. It meant the working group. It meant 8 weeks. It meant nothing. The public statement the cooperative released the following week described ongoing monitoring of former conflict sites as part of standard post-war environmental assessment. It did not mention signals. It did not mention the network geometry. It mentioned, at the end, that some researchers had raised questions about the nature of the Vorrkai withdrawal that were under scientific review. Some researchers. Under scientific review. She read the statement in her car, in the parking garage beneath the facility, and sat there for a while in the dark. Yusuf found her there 20 minutes later. She was not sure how he knew to look, and he sat in the passenger seat without being invited, and they both stared at the concrete wall in front of the car. The working group will do good work, he said. In 8 weeks. They'll have 6 weeks if they push it. Yusuf. She closed her eyes. What if I'm right? What if in 6 weeks, whatever is under those 17 sites activates because the Vorrkai finished priming it before they left, and we spent those 6 weeks in a committee? He was quiet for a while. What do you think is under the sites? I've been running models. She opened her eyes. The concrete wall did not offer anything useful. I keep coming back to resonance. The signals are at a frequency that corresponds to, there's a geological concept called critical resonance frequency, the specific frequency at which a given medium, subjected to sustained directed energy, begins to undergo structural transformation. Different for every composition of rock and substrate. If you wanted to prime a planetary crust for a specific kind of resonance event, you'd need to know the exact local geology at each node. You'd need to have spent significant time on the ground, taking measurements, adjusting. She paused. You'd need, for instance, 22 months on a Peruvian plateau. A resonance event, Yusuf repeated. What does that mean in practical terms? In practical terms? She turned to look at him. It means the planet's crust, at 17 precise and evenly distributed points, begins to vibrate at a frequency that propagates outward and downward simultaneously, intersecting at the mantle. It means the mantle, which has been primed by 2 years of distributed low-frequency bombardment, begins to respond. She watched him understand. It means we've been sitting on a bomb for 6 years, Yusuf. We've been fighting over the surface of a bomb while they planted the detonators. Yusuf stared at her. How long? He said. The signal cycles at 40,000 seconds. I think each cycle advances the priming sequence by a fixed increment. Based on the signal strength and what I can model of resonance propagation in the substrate at Site 7, she had not said this number out loud yet. 5 months. Maybe 6. He stared at her for another long moment. Then he took out his phone. Who are you calling? She asked. Everyone I can think of, he said. The next 5 months were the worst of her life, and she had survived 6 years of alien warfare. The working group met. It reviewed her methodology with careful, respectful thoroughness, and produced a report at the 8-week mark that confirmed the signals were real, confirmed the geometric patterning, expressed measured concern about the resonance hypothesis, and recommended further study with a 12-week timeline and a modest resource allocation. It was a good report. It was the kind of report that would look excellent in a post-event inquiry, when everyone was trying to understand how the warnings had been documented and then quietly filed. She gave interviews. 2 science journals ran her paper on the departure vector analysis. 1 major newspaper ran a feature, Scientist Warns, Was the Vorrkai Victory Too Good to Be True? It got significant attention for 4 days, was disputed by 3 prominent physicists who had not actually engaged with the underlying data, and then was eclipsed by the announcement that the first fully reconstructed city, Marseille, was open to returnees. She wrote to 47 world leaders. She received 31 responses. Most were polite. A few were dismissive. General Vance's office sent a 2-paragraph letter that expressed appreciation for her continued vigilance and noted that the relevant findings had been forwarded to the appropriate bodies. She found allies. A geophysicist in Christchurch named Dr. Hemi Walker, who had independently noticed anomalous low-frequency signatures at one of the 17 sites and had been unable to get anyone to pay attention. A Vorrkai xenolinguistic specialist, Dr. Yael Brenner, who had spent 4 years analyzing Vorrkai behavioral patterns and concluded that the concept of victory in any conventional sense was probably not part of their cognitive architecture, that they completed processes rather than winning contests, and that a completed process had no reason to stop partway through. A structural geologist who read Mara's resonance propagation model and turned white and agreed to co-author a supplementary analysis. The supplementary analysis was published. It received measured, respectful attention in the scientific community. Several people wrote thoughtful responses. One response specifically praised the elegance of the modeling while questioning whether the resonance threshold parameters were conservative enough, which was an excellent point and which she addressed in a follow-up paper, and by that time it was month 4. Month 4, and the signals at the 17 sites were measurably stronger. She had finally managed to get instrumentation at 5 of them, not all 17, 5, and the strength was increasing precisely in line with her model. The cycling period was shortening. The priming was accelerating. She went back to Vance's office. Not the video screen this time. She flew to Washington. She sat across from the woman in person and laid out the updated data with the kind of clarity she had been honing for 4 months, stripped of qualifications and hedges, just the numbers and what the numbers said. The cycling period has dropped from 40,000 seconds to 31,000 seconds, she said. That's a 22% acceleration. My original model predicted 20%. I was nearly exactly right, General. My model is correct. And if my model is correct about the acceleration, it is correct about the timeline. Vance looked at the numbers. Mara could see her looking at them with genuine attention, which was more than she'd gotten from most people. 5 weeks, Vance said. 4 to 6. For if the acceleration continues, 6 if it plateaus. It won't plateau. It hasn't plateaued. And your mitigation proposals. Destruction of the devices at all 17 sites simultaneously. If we take them out one at a time, the remaining nodes may compensate, the network may have redundancy. All 17, simultaneously. It's the only way to interrupt the priming sequence at this stage. Do you have a confidence level on that mitigation approach? 40%, she said. Vance looked up. 40% that it works, Mara said. Better than 0. Which is the alternative? Vance was quiet for a long time. She looked out her window. The street below was full of people, the easy traffic of a city beginning to rebuild itself, scaffolding and fresh paint and someone's radio playing music she couldn't hear through the glass. The political situation, Vance said slowly, is not favorable. You understand that. Authorizing the destruction of sites that much of the public has been told are simply old alien positions, disrupting reconstruction operations in some of those areas, the resource allocation, she paused. The optics of saying the war isn't over, that we were fooled, at this specific moment. General. Mara kept her voice perfectly level. She had practiced this. In 4 to 6 weeks, the planetary crust begins to destabilize at 17 evenly distributed points. The models suggest cascade failure of the mantle within 48 to 96 hours of initial activation. The casualties will be, she stopped. She had looked at the casualty projections once and had not been able to eat dinner. I'm not asking you to manage optics. I'm asking you to prevent an extinction event. Vance looked at her. Then she looked at the window again. I'm going to escalate this to the Security Council, she said. That's the highest level I can take it. What happens there is out of my hands. It was not a yes. But it was not nothing. The Security Council met in emergency session in week 5. Mara was not invited to speak. She was represented by a summary document and by Yusuf, who attended in his capacity as military liaison and who was the best advocate she could have asked for and who called her afterward from outside the building, standing on the steps, and told her what had happened. They've authorized an investigative mission to all 17 sites, he said. Full team. 48 hours to assess and report. She was sitting in her hotel room, and she closed her eyes. An investigative mission. Mara. Not a destruction order. Not a mitigation operation. An investigative mission. The timeline they've been given is... We have 3 weeks, Yusuf. I know. An investigative mission takes time to assemble, time to deploy, time to conduct, time to report. By the time they report, it will be. I know. His voice was the flattest she had ever heard it. I know. I told them. I used your exact numbers. I used your exact words. 3 council members asked questions that showed they understood. 2 of them voted against even the investigative mission. He paused. 4 abstained. She sat in the hotel room. She had done everything right. She had been exactly, precisely, empirically correct at every point. Her model had been accurate to within 3% for 4 months. She had raised the alarm, raised it again, raised it louder, raised it through every channel available to her, and the world had assessed her alarm and decided it could be assessed a little longer. "Yusuf," she said. "Yeah. I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to help me get to Site 7. A long pause. "Mara. Not to stop it. I don't think we can stop it anymore. I need to document it. I need to be there with instrumentation running so that we get the clearest possible data on what happens and how it happens and how long each phase takes, because if anything survives—" She stopped. She made herself continue. "If anything survives, they'll need to know." Another pause. Longer this time. "Okay," he said. "I'll get you there." She was on the Peruvian plateau on the morning it began. Not just her, she had Yusuf, Dr. Walker from Christchurch, and 3 technicians with more instrumentation than she'd ever worked with in the field. The investigative mission, it turned out, had freed up some resources. They were all armed, which felt both necessary and absurd, because there was nothing to shoot. The Vorrkai container structure in the center of the plateau was different now. Not visibly, it looked identical to when she'd first found it, but the instruments told a different story. The signal had changed from a cycle to a continuous stream. The frequency had locked. The priming sequence was complete. She had been right to the week. She stood beside the structure at 6:23 a.m., in the early light, with the high plateau spreading in every direction and the mountains cutting a dark edge against the sky, and she watched the instruments and understood that what was beginning now could not be stopped. The 17 sites were networked, each one feeding into the next in a closed loop. To interrupt one, you'd have had to interrupt all 17 simultaneously, and you'd have had to do it before the lock-in, and the lock-in had occurred at approximately 4 a.m., 3 hours ago, while she'd been trying to sleep in a tent and not quite succeeding. She was not panicking. This surprised her a little. She had expected to panic. What she felt instead was a terrible, specific, almost crystalline clarity. Her instruments showed the first resonance pulse at 6:31 a.m. It came from below, not sound exactly, but something her body interpreted as sound, a deep subaudible pressure that she felt in her jaw and her chest rather than her ears. The plateau surface registered a 0.003 mm vertical oscillation. Trivial on its own. At 6:32 a.m., the second pulse. Slightly stronger. "It's building," said Dr. Walker, looking at his seismograph. His voice was professionally steady. She appreciated that. "Record everything," she said. "All channels. All of it." At 6:35 a.m., her phone began receiving alerts. The alerts were from seismic monitoring stations around the world. Unusual readings. Multiple locations. 7 sites confirmed within the first minute, then 12, then, as the systems caught up with what they were seeing, all 17. The cascade was faster than her most aggressive model had predicted. She had estimated 48 to 96 hours to mantle failure. By 7:15 a.m., she revised this estimate. By 8 a.m., she had her laptop open and was transmitting everything she had, all the instrument readings, all the documentation, all the models and analyses and papers and everything, to every secure server she could access, to colleagues on 6 continents, to Yusuf's contacts, to anyone who might have a facility deep enough and shielded enough to survive long enough to be useful afterward. The plateau was moving now in ways she could feel without instruments. A vibration that had begun as subtle and grown to something she could track visually, watching the surface. At 10:47 a.m., the first major seismic event was reported, a 9.4 magnitude along the Pacific Rim, simultaneous with an 8.9 in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Not natural. Perfectly synchronized. 17 separate events across 17 zones, timed to reinforce each other, amplifying the resonance cycle with each pass. Yusuf appeared at her shoulder. She was aware that the 3 technicians had retreated to the vehicles. She did not blame them. "Mara," he said. We should go. Where? He didn't answer, because there was nowhere, and they both knew it. She looked at her laptop screen. The data was still transmitting. She thought about the 47 world leaders, the board with its good chairs and its catered lunch, the working group, the investigative mission, the further study, all the careful, reasonable, well-intentioned machinery of people who had needed more time and had taken it. She thought about the sky over Lima, which had been blue this morning. She thought about the streets of Marseille, full of people coming home. She kept transmitting. 6 months and 11 days after the Vorrkai disappeared, Dr. Mara Osei transmitted her final data packet from a shelter 300 meters below a mountain in the Peruvian Andes, where the geology was old and stable enough to have survived the first 4 resonance cycles. She was with Yusuf, Dr. Walker, and 2 of the 3 technicians. The third, a young woman named Fadila who had been brilliant with the spectrometer, had gone back toward Lima before the road became impassable. They did not know what had happened to her. From the shelter, they could feel but not hear what was happening to the world above. The instruments still worked. The instruments told them everything in frequencies and amplitudes and waveforms, which was precise and complete and not, in the way of all data about things too large to look at directly, entirely real. The seismic events had peaked at 11.7 and were cycling downward now, which her models had predicted. The resonance loop would decay over the next several months as the energy dissipated into the mantle. Eventually, in her estimation, 8 to 14 months, the surface would stabilize enough for significant portions of it to be habitable again. Significantly altered. Significantly reduced. But habitable. There would be survivors. She had calculated that too. The final number, she thought, would be somewhere between a few tens of millions and a few hundred million, distributed across the areas of greatest geological stability, the places where the resonance had been weakest, the places where the Vorrkai's network had been thinnest. There would be survivors. The planet would not die. But civilization, as she had known it, as 6 billion people had known it, as the people dancing in Sao Paulo and the children in the roads outside Lima and the families coming home to Marseille had known it, was a different question. She sat in the shelter with her laptop and her instruments, and she wrote. Not for publication. There was no publication anymore. Not for any official record. The bodies that had kept official records were, most of them, gone. She wrote because writing was what she had always done when she needed to understand something, and she needed to understand this. The Vorrkai, she wrote, did not make war. They conducted a survey. The war, 6 years of it, 47 nations, uncountable dead, was the noise they generated while their survey teams worked. They needed time and access to 17 sites. They needed the military and scientific attention of humanity directed upward and outward, toward their ships, toward their weapons, toward the spectacle of our own destruction. They needed us looking at the wrong thing for long enough to do the right thing. And we obliged, and when they were finished, they left, and we looked at their departure and called it victory. She paused. Outside the shelter, hundreds of meters above, in a world made mostly of vibration now, the resonance cycle pulsed. I don't blame the generals. I don't blame the politicians, or the board, or the Security Council, or the Secretary General, or any of the particular humans who received my warnings and decided, in each case, that the cost of believing me was higher than the cost of waiting. They were not wrong that the cost was high. The cost of appending a world that had just decided it was saved is genuinely, staggeringly high. I was asking them to pay it on the basis of numbers and models and a pattern in departure vectors that I could see and they could not feel. That is the problem. Humans feel first and think second, and they can be made to think carefully about data, but they cannot be made to feel the data, and it is the feeling that drives the machine of collective action. I could make them think I might be right. I could not make them feel that they were in danger, because the sky was blue and the war was over and the children were in the roads. She looked at Yusuf, who was asleep in his chair, which was the most useful thing he could do right now, and she looked at Dr. Walker, who was monitoring the instruments and writing his own notes in a small paper journal that he'd brought because he'd been a field scientist for 30 years and never gone anywhere without a paper journal, and she thought that these were 2 people she was glad to have next to her. What the Vorrkai took from us, she wrote, was not our technology or our cities or our population, though they took all of those. What they took was the version of ourselves that could have survived this. We were, 6 months ago, a species that had endured 6 years of sustained existential warfare and had not collapsed. We had adapted. We had improvised. We had maintained enough institutional coherence under conditions of extreme stress to coordinate across 47 nations. We were, I believe, capable of hearing my warning and acting on it. We chose not to, because the war was over, and the choice to believe the war was not over was unbearable. They knew that. They planned for that. The silence after their departure was not an accident. It was the last weapon. She stopped writing for a while. She listened to the rock around them, to its deep structural patience, to the improbable fact that it was holding. Then she wrote one more thing. The Vorrkai will not come back. I am certain of this, not because I believe they're merciful, but because there is no longer any reason to. They found what they were looking for, or did what they came to do, and the event they orchestrated was not an ending for them but a transition, a movement from one state to another whose purpose I do not yet understand and may not live to understand. We were not their enemies. We were not their prey. We were, I think, their substrate. Whatever they planted in the mantle of this world, whatever they primed and activated and walked away from, is there now, doing what it does, evolving through its own cycle at its own pace, indifferent to us in the way that roots are indifferent to the soil. I spent 4 months trying to warn the world. The world had too much at stake in not listening. This is the shape of it, not stupidity, not cowardice, just the specific human inability to mourn a salvation while it is still warm. We won the war. We celebrated. We were, for 6 months, briefly and completely and genuinely free. It was enough to kill us. She closed the laptop. Above her, the world continued its long, slow, irresistible transformation, the resonance cycling through the rock answering in its deep geological voice, the 17 points of the Vorrkai network pulsing in their perfect symmetry, doing whatever they had always been intended to do, unhurried and precise and patient as a process with no reason to rush. The shelter held. In the corner, Yusuf breathed evenly in his sleep. Outside, the sky, which she could not see but which she knew was still there, was, she imagined, very blue.